Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Ulysses S. Grant, Part 6, Victory at Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1863. We stopped last time in 1863, in July, shortly after the major victory of Vicksburg, Mississippi. President Lincoln had this to say about the Mississippi River, quote, "The father of waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Texas and Arizona had been sheared off from the Confederacy. There was a loss of western horses and cattle. The fall of Vicksburg for Southerners was the demise of the Confederacy for many. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was depressed. President Lincoln was happy. There was also the victory simultaneously at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's a major celebration in Washington, D.C. Ulysses S. Grant was in direct correspondence with President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wrote a letter to Grant and said he was very grateful for Grant's service. There was a strong bond between Lincoln and Grant. Grant said that he could not have taken Vicksburg without the Emancipation Proclamation, and this delighted President Lincoln. Lincoln called Grant, quote, his fighting general. Lincoln supported Grant despite Congressman pressuring him to remove Grant. Halleck said that Grant at Vicksburg was like Napoleon at Ulm, in which Napoleon trapped the Austrian army who surrendered without a fight. On July 7th, Grant became a major general. He had financial security. The two victories, Vicksburg and Gettysburg, made the Union a favorite to win the war. Robert E. Lee's mystique was weakened by Gettysburg. There was an advantage for the Union in population and numbers of soldiers. Vicksburg gave Grant fame and political possibilities. His aide, John Rawlins, was sick. William Tecumseh Sherman was going on foraging parties, getting corn, cattle, hogs, sheep, and poultry, and destroying the morale of the South. On July 16th, Confederate General Johnston, after shelling by Sherman near Jackson, fled east. In mid-July, there were draft riots in New York City. It showed that there was a need for more black troops. On August 9th, President Lincoln said to Grant that he needed more black troops. A few days after the fall of Vicksburg, Grant was invited to a dinner by an Iowa woman named Annie Wittenmeyer. A large crowd of black people came to see Grant, the man who was bringing them freedom. Grant was a man of action. Idleness was an enemy. He planned to attack Mobile, Alabama, but couldn't take action because it was too hot and it was too far away. There was a problem of foreigners and Europeans in Mexico. Grant sent a division under Nathaniel Banks to Texas. There was a lull in the fighting. Late in August, Grant traveled to Cairo, Illinois to see Julia before the three older children went to school in St. Louis. In Memphis, Tennessee, there were two dinners honoring Grant. The challenge was they were serving alcohol. Grant's sympathetic approach turned the tide of public opinion in Memphis, Tennessee, one of the most devoted cities to the Confederacy. On August 25th, the Board of Trade in Memphis had a dinner in honor of Grant, and they compared him to Hernando de Soto and Robert Fulton. Grant attended banquets and had his wine glasses inverted. He did not drink. In Memphis, Julia was in St. Louis and was at a hotel and was serenaded by a huge crowd who cheered when she appeared on the balcony. On September 2nd, Grant traveled to New Orleans. He was relaxing after terrible pressure. There was temptation to drink. He conferred with General Banks and went to Banks' residence. For hours, there were storms of people who came to see Grant. He remained cool and calm. On September 4th, Banks had a grand review to honor Grant. There were regiments with banners from the famous victories that Grant had achieved. Grant tipped his hat. Grant and other generals rode back to New Orleans. They got into a horse race, and Grant sprinted ahead, and then ensued disaster. His horse jumped into a hole and fell. Grant was thrown. He landed on his head and shoulders. His leg was crushed and he was unconscious. His leg was swollen and he ended up being on crutches for 2 months. And he was in bed for a time, smoking cigars and reading. On September 16th, he returned to Vicksburg to rest. He was working to form black regiments. He created the 63rd and 64th United States Colored Infantry Regiments. There was action in Tennessee. On September 2nd, General Burnside took Knoxville in the east. On September 9th, General William Rosecrans took Chattanooga. On September 19th, the Battle of Chickamauga near Chattanooga, Confederate General Braxton Bragg against Rosecrans, and this was a major Confederate victory. Chickamauga was a major Union defeat. There were 20,000 killed and wounded or taken prisoner. Union General George H. Thomas did well at Chickamauga, and he earned the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga in the midst of defeat. Rosecrans' army retreated to Chattanooga, and Rosecrans' reputation was in ruins. General Rosecrans was weak and vain, and he procrastinated and had cowardice. There was a threat of starvation for Union troops at Chattanooga. Stanton sent a telegram to Grant to relieve Rosecrans in Chattanooga. Grant initially sent Sherman to Chattanooga from Vicksburg to Memphis. Sherman was with his family. His son Willie had died of typhus at Vicksburg. Stanton sent 20,000 troops from the Army of the Potomac to Tennessee by a railroad with 3,000 horses, 11 days, 1,200 miles, crossing the Appalachian Mountains, the Ohio River twice. It was a brilliant success. On October 3rd, Halleck wanted Grant to travel to Nashville via Cairo, 6 days by steamboat from Vicksburg to Cairo. There was strong criticism of Rosecrans. However, he was popular in Ohio. President Lincoln wanted to fire Rosecrans, but wanted to wait after the Ohio gubernatorial elections in October. On October 16th, Grant was in Cairo on crutches. He took a train to Louisville and changed trains and came to Indianapolis and learned the Secretary of Stanton and Ohio Governor John Brough were there, and he met them. Stanton came to Grant's car and they shook hands. Stanton shook hands with a bearded man he believed to be Grant, which was not him, because Grant looked too ordinary. He was calm. Grant was calm. Grant was leery of Stanton, who was high-strung and domineering. Stanton brought 2 orders from President Lincoln. There needed to be a new military division of the Mississippi, combining the Ohio, Cumberland, and Tennessee, and Grant in command. Grant was in Louisville, Kentucky at the Galt House, and people flocked to see him. There was news that Rosecrans planned to abandon Chattanooga. Grant believed that retreat would be catastrophic. Grant replaced Rosecrans with General Thomas. Grant told Thomas to hold Chattanooga. Thomas said, quote, "We will hold the town till we starve." Abraham Lincoln and Edwin Stanton, after many lousy generals, finally had a team assembled that would win the war. The fall of Rosecrans surprised the public. Rosecrans used opium. He was sad and had misconduct at Chickamauga. Grant said that any general would be better than Rosecrans. On October 20th, Grant started the trip to Chattanooga himself, passing through Nashville. There was Grant mania. Soldiers crowded the railroad tracks wanting to see General Grant. He met the Tennessee Governor Andrew Johnson there, future president, at the St. Cloud Hotel. Andrew Johnson gave a long speech, and then Grant said, quote, "I never made a speech in my life, and am too old to learn now." This charmed the crowd. Grant reached Stevenson, Alabama, near the Tennessee border, and met with Rosecrans. The last 60 miles to Chattanooga was on horseback. It was harrowing. Grant was in pain from his leg injury. The trail was tough and steep. Grant was lifted onto a horse with his crutches strapped to the side. Grant remained stoic. There are thousands of dead horses and mules on the way. On October 23rd, Grant arrived in the Chattanooga headquarters of General George Thomas. Thomas was loyal to Rosecrans and was angry with Grant. Rawlins was angry about the poor reception given to Grant. He asked for dry clothes and food for General Grant. Captain Horace Porter became a key aide for General Grant. Grant was slightly stooped, 5'8", 135 pounds. He asked many questions. He quickly understood the Army's situation in Chattanooga, which was complicated with logistical issues. For Abraham Lincoln, it was high priority to keep Chattanooga. It was the entryway to the industrial heartland of the South, of arsenals and factories in Georgia and Alabama. Chattanooga was in a valley. It was surrounded by Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain. Confederates held both heights. The Union troops were trapped. They lacked ammunition and only had enough for one day of fighting. It was a bad situation. They faced starvation or surrender. 10,000 horses and mules had already starved. The soldiers were on half rations, eating leathery meat and hard bread. Grant saw that there was a need to restore the health and morale of the troops. They needed a new water and land route to bring in food on the Tennessee River, Brown's Ferry, and a wagon road and a pontoon bridge. It was very complicated. Grant infused a fighting spirit in the men at Chattanooga. Grant at one point saw men packing crackers on a wagon in a very sloppy manner and said, quote, "That won't do, men. Those crackers are going to men who are starving. Every cracker is precious, and the more boxes you get into that wagon, the more hungry men you will feed tonight." Grant brought new vitality to the sluggish, downcast army at Chattanooga. Union forces broke open a route from Bridgeport to near Chattanooga, and then the line became, "The cracker line is open. Full rations, boys." Food, clothing, and forage poured in. Suddenly, the Union troops were better fed and better clothed and were more numerous than the rebels. Grant's logistical skills as quartermaster in the Mexican army came in handy and rejuvenated the army at Chattanooga. Grant rebuilt 182 bridges and restored 102 miles of railroad that had been destroyed by the rebel armies. He strengthened his supply line. At Chattanooga, Grant's Confederate counterpart was Braxton Bragg, whom Grant knew from the Mexican War. Bragg was a North Carolina native who loved crushing the spirit of his men, forcing his men to watch executions of deserters. He was not loved or respected by his men. Bragg achieved victories at Perryville, Stones River, and Chickamauga. Bragg's era was sending 20,000 troops with General Longstreet to attack Union forces and General Burnside in Knoxville, Tennessee. President Lincoln had a paternal regard for the loyal people of eastern Tennessee. Grant hoped to help Burnside by defeating Bragg at Chattanooga, pressuring Longstreet to return. Grant's message to Burnside was hold eastern Tennessee. Grant believed that the war hinged on saving Chattanooga. In mid-November, Grant was healthy. Sherman arrived at Chattanooga, William Tecumseh Sherman, the two good friends, Grant and Sherman. Grant offered him a cigar and a rocking chair. Grant said, quote, "Take the place of honor, Sherman." And Sherman responded, quote, "Oh no, that belongs to you, General." Then Grant said, quote, "Never mind that. I always give precedence to age." Sherman, "Well, if you put it on that ground, I must accept." Grant, Sherman, and Thomas had a long talk about how to defeat Bragg. The plan was for Sherman and Hooker to attack Missionary Ridge. Grant was confident he was a tower of strength. His flaw was drinking. A bottle of wine arrived from Grant's mother at this time, and John Rollins said, quote, "Who brought that?" And the answer was, "The General's mother sent it." And Rollins said, quote, "The General's family are all fools." Rollins wanted to visit his fiancée in Connecticut, but he would only do so if Julia came to Grant and would protect him from drinking. On November 18th, Grant had 80,000 men ready to attack Missionary Ridge. The attack was scheduled for November 21st. There were heavy rains on November 20th, lots of mud. It was impossible to move Sherman's wagons, livestock, and artillery. The attack was delayed till November 22nd. There was fighting in Knoxville. Grant was eager to attack. The Confederate troops were starved and miserable. On November 23rd, the Army of the Cumberland and General George Thomas attacked the plain in front of Missionary Ridge. On November 24th, Sherman crossed the Tennessee River and attacked the northern end of Missionary Ridge. Hooker attacked Lookout Mountain. The Confederates retreated. The Union forces took Lookout Mountain. At the attack at Missionary Ridge, there were 23,000 men. The rebels retreated. The Union taunt was Chickamauga, the defeat they were seeking to avenge. In the ascent at Missionary Ridge, the Union general, Phil Sheridan, reveled. He was thrilled and said, quote, "Forward, boys, forward. We can go to the top. Come on, boys, give 'em hell." On the mountaintop, Arthur MacArthur Jr. from Wisconsin, the father of World War II General Douglas MacArthur, drove in the first regimental flag. Grant expected his men to pause at the first trenches and climb up in an orderly stages, and was surprised by what happened. The ascent of Missionary Ridge was spontaneous, not ordered. Grant decided not to countermand this impulsive action. Grant said, quote, "The boys feel pretty good. Let them alone a while." Grant was astonished that there were few casualties at Missionary Ridge. Grant's theory was that the rebels were surprised by the audacity of the charge and fell into a state of confusion and purposeless aiming of their pieces. For Grant, Shiloh and Missionary Ridge were his most satisfying battles. Confederate General Bragg fled into Georgia. Grant was happy. Grant was away from Burnside in Knoxville. Bragg sent his resignation to Richmond, which was accepted. Grant chased Bragg to Ringgold, Georgia, 20 miles southeast of Chattanooga. Grant was generous in victory. He passed a line of rebel prisoners, lifted his hat, and held it in respect till they were passed. General Ulysses S. Grant's reputation reached new heights after the major victory at Chattanooga, Tennessee. Grant had achieved the impossible. Most of Tennessee was free of rebels, and he prepared an invasion of Georgia. President Lincoln wrote to Grant, quote, "I wish to tender you and all your command my more than thanks, my profoundest gratitude for the skill, courage, and perseverance with which you and they, over so great difficulties, have effected the important object. God bless you all. A. Lincoln." On November 23rd, Burnside sent a message to Grant that he had 10 days of supplies left, and then he would need to surrender to Longstreet. Grant said 20,000 soldiers to break the siege. Longstreet learned about this and left Knoxville and returned to Virginia. President Lincoln was happy. The eastern Tennessee and the Unionists there were free of rebel control. Sherman arrived in Knoxville to find that Burnside had plenty of food, and he was able to, and there was food in the countryside. This was surprising. Grant wanted to go down the Mississippi River and take Mobile and attack Georgia and the Alabama interiors. However, Lincoln vetoed that. He wanted to protect Tennessee. Lincoln had strong support for Grant. When Lincoln received the news that Chattanooga and Knoxville were safe, he advised the Northern public to go to church and thank God. Congress passed a resolution thanking Grant for the victories in eastern Tennessee. Lincoln hesitated to bring Grant east. In December, there was a movement for Grant to receive the Democratic nomination for president in 1864. Grant was very anti this. He was not interested. Lincoln was worried that Grant would develop a desire to become president. On December 14th, Elihu Washburn in the House had a House bill resurrected ranking the lieutenant general position. George Washington was the only one to receive it. Grant would become the second. President Lincoln supported it. On December 20th, Grant relocated his headquarters to Nashville and planned campaigns against Atlanta, Montgomery, and Mobile. December, Grant received a letter from Barnabas Burns, an Ohio War Democrat. He wanted Grant to be the candidate for president in 1864 for the War Democrats. Historian H.W. Brands wrote, quote, "On reading this letter, Grant reflected on what remarkable turns life took. 3 years earlier, he had to beg his father for a menial job in the family leather store. Now he was being promoted for the most powerful job in America." Grant worked that winter of 1863-64, getting supplies for the armies for the spring campaign of 1864. He was decisive under pressure. At one point, he approved a large expenditure quickly. Asked if he was sure if he was correct, he said, quote, "No, I am not. But in war, anything is better than indecision. We must decide. If I am wrong, we shall soon find out and can do the other thing. But not to decide wastes both time and money and may ruin everything." There was a logistical emphasis that winter to ensure supply lines. Grant did not rely on secondhand information. He toured Chattanooga, Knoxville, and Lexington. Hard riding on tough roads was good exercise. There were unsightly remains of the war, broken wagons and dead animals. Union loyalists lined the road. Grant was 41 years old. People assumed he was older. He was traveling with a medical director who was older, and people crowded around him. Grant was amused and happy to escape the crowd. Grant became a national hero. That winter, he spent time with Julia in Nashville. Nashville, Tennessee was a city of woe. 19 of 20 people were mourning friends killed in battles. Julia was going to the hospitals, and she received petitions for discharge. Grant did not like Julia going to the hospitals. He needed Julia to stay home, and he needed rest from the war. Grant was sad about the war and needed a break, and he asked Julia to stop going, and she did, and stayed at home so she could comfort him. Grant in Nashville pursued black troops for the Army. By the end of 1864, there were 100,000 black troops in the Union Army. Brigadier General Augustus L. Chefland commanded those black troops. He recruited and organized them in Tennessee and western Kentucky. Grant's son Fred contracted typhoid fever at the siege of Vicksburg and almost died, but did recover. Julia in St. Louis went to a doctor looking to correct her strabismus, an eye issue. Doctor told Julia she was too old for the operation. She told Grant, who was surprised. Julia said, quote, "Why, you are getting to be such a great man, and I am such a plain little wife. I thought if my eyes were as others are, I might not be so very, very plain." Grant said, quote, Did I not see you and fall in love with you with those same eyes? I like them just as they are. And now remember, you are not to interfere with them. They are mine, and I tell you, Mrs. Grant, you had better not make any experiments, as I might not like you half so well with any other eyes. Truly, Grant and Julia loved each other very, very much. In St. Louis, Grant and Julia attended the theater. They saw the drama Richelieu. At the intermission, the crowd saw Grant and cheered him for a long time. At the Lindell House, there was a banquet honoring Grant. Julia's father, Colonel Dent, came. He saw his son-in-law that he had disrespected being honored. A few years earlier, Grant had been destitute in St. Louis. Now he was famous. John Rawlins worried that Grant would drink. Rawlins was sick with tuberculosis and depressed. In February, Grant's fate was debated in Washington, D.C. Grant was unwilling to work in Washington, D.C. He wanted to be in the field with his army. Grant respected Halleck and did not want to be promoted over Halleck. Grant was promoted and received a new salary of $8,640 a year. However, he still feared financial ruin. Eli Washburn in the House said that Grant had, quote, captured more prisoners and taken more guns than any general in modern times. James Doolittle in the Senate said that Grant had won 17 battles, taken 100,000 prisoners, and 500 artillery pieces. March 3rd of 1864, Grant received a telegram summoning him to Washington, D.C. to receive the commission of lieutenant general from President Lincoln. Rawlins and Sherman worried about the perils of Washington, D.C. for Ulysses S. Grant. On March 4th, Grant left Nashville to travel to Washington. Big crowds greeted him at the train stations on the way. Grant was not willing to be stationed in Washington. He arrived in Washington on March 8th with his son Fred, age 13, as his companion. Under military protocol, he needed to visit General Halleck. Washington, D.C. was unhealthy because of sewage on the Potomac River and disease. The Capitol dome was finished. However, the Washington Monument was still a stub. Grant went to the Willard Hotel, a popular place for politics. Congressmen, job seekers, and political deals were made there. Grant entered the lobby of the Willard Hotel unnoticed. The desk clerk treated him with casual contempt because Grant was short and dressed in a shabby manner. The clerk said that maybe he could find a small top-floor room if it was available. Then Grant signed the Registrar, U.S. Grant & Son, Galena, Illinois. The clerk immediately changed from haughty to fawning. He gave Grant Parlor 6, the most luxurious suite where President Lincoln had stayed before his inauguration. Grant and Fred went to the dining room at the Willard Hotel. For a few minutes they were not recognized, then there was pandemonium. A congressman said, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, the hero of Donelson, of Vicksburg, and of Chattanooga is among us." Hundreds of diners cheered and stomped, twirled their handkerchiefs, and banged knives on tables. So many came to shake his hand that he couldn't eat and finally fled. Writer Richard Henry Dana, Jr. wrote about Grant, quote, "He gets over the ground queerly. He does not march, not quite walk, but pitches along as if the next step would bring him on his nose." There was a soiree at the White House, President Lincoln's weekly reception, and a big crowd came to see Grant, whom they heard was coming. Lincoln and Grant met for the first time, and President Lincoln said, quote, "Why, here is General Grant. Well, this is a great pleasure, I assure you." Grant and Lincoln were a strange pair. Lincoln was tall, talkative, and funny. Grant was short, quiet, and serious. There was Grant mania in the White House. There was a chant during the soiree, "Grant, Grant, Grant." Grant was short and hard to see, so they asked him to stand on a couch so the people could see him. However, Grant did not like them. It was uncomfortable and embarrassed and wanted to return to the camp. The next day he received the Lieutenant General Commission. Guests at that included John Nicolay, General Halleck, John Rawlins, and his son Fred. In March, Grant, as we said, was in Washington, D.C. President Lincoln liked Grant. Lincoln had dealt with the Napoleonic John C. Fremont and George McClellan and the blustery show-offs like Hooker and Pope. Lincoln said that Grant was plain, direct, unassuming, soft-spoken, simple, not afraid of great responsibility. Grant said, quote, "With the aid of the noble armies that have fought on so many fields for our common country, it will be my earnest endeavor not to disappoint your expectations. I feel the full weight of the responsibilities now devolving on me, and know that if they are met, it will be due to those armies, and above all to the favor of that providence which leads both nations and men." Grant wanted to make his headquarters in the West. Lincoln wanted Grant to come east to raise the sagging fortunes of the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln said that millions of dollars were being spent every day. They needed to win the war and end it because it was financially catastrophic. Grant was a man of action and aggressive. The South understood the danger of Grant in command because he fought hard and was aggressive and fearless. On March 10th, Grant visited General George Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac in Culpeper, Virginia. Grant and Meade had last met in the Mexican War. Meade had a habit of insulting others. Meade was competent and experienced. Meade's failure was failing to pursue Lee after Gettysburg. Grant and Meade lit cigars and talked. Grant wanted to remove Meade, but he wanted to wait. Grant was creating a new Army of the Potomac. He believed that the failures of the Army of the Potomac was because of poor leaders. Meade continued in his command of the Army of the Potomac for the time being. Phil Sheridan was in charge of cavalry, and Sherman was in charge of the West. Grant knew he needed to gain the respect of the men of the Army of the Potomac. Grant had good human relations. He assembled a team to win the war. Grant returned to Washington, D.C. He was invited to watch a performance of Richard III, starring Edwin Booth, by President Lincoln. However, he declined. A dinner in his honor at the White House was scheduled. He declined that as well. He was anxious to return west and go back to work. And Grant said, quote, "And really, Mr. Lincoln, I've had enough of this show business." Henry Halleck had been demoted to chief of staff in Washington, D.C., doing office work and paperwork. Grant and Halleck had a good relationship. On March 14, 1864, Grant arrived in Nashville. Grant was ready to face the famous Robert E. Lee. Grant again met Andrew Johnson and went to a performance of Hamlet. A soldier in the audience during the performance, when Hamlet was saying his soliloquy over Yorick's skull, this soldier in the audience said, quote, "Say, pard, what is it, yank or reb?" This led to a tumult, and Grant left the interrupted performance to dine on oysters. Grant's strategy was to attack Lee. Sherman would attack Johnston. Grant visited his parents in Covington, Kentucky. His mother asked him if he was afraid of Robert E. Lee. Grant said no. Grant knew Lee. March 22nd, Grant was in Philadelphia, met General Dallas B. Sackett. March 23rd, Grant was in Washington, D.C. again with Julia and son Jesse, age 6. He had his photograph taken at the studio of Matthew Brady. There was an accident, and a skylight broke and fell. There was sharp glass all around him. He remained calm and was unhurt. Grant was planning the spring campaign. Grant had a voracious appetite for maps. He was determined to master the minute details of the rolling fields, woods, rivers, and roads between the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Rapidan River. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.